So before we get into any extracurricular stretching of the hamstrings, we need to figure out how your hamstrings are tight. The one of two main ways that the hamstrings are tight, I ask the question, are you too butt? Is your butt sticking out too much? Or are you not too butt? The other side of that spectrum. That's where I get the clever phrase, too butt or not too butt. That is the question. Once we figure out if you're too butt or not too butt, then we start to understand what's going on with tightness in the hamstring. If I'm too butt, if you imagine your pelvis like a bowl, and if the pelvis is tipping forward, the liquid from the bowl would pour out. This is too butt. We call this an anterior tilt to the pelvis. If the pelvis is doing the other thing, not too butt, I'm losing my butt, then the pelvic bowl is tipping back, and if there were water in the pelvic bowl, it would spill back. What I'm essentially looking for is a nice neutral pelvis. There'll be a slight anterior tilt to the pelvis. This is normal and natural, but we don't want to over-accentuate it into like a sway back, and we don't want to grossly under-accentuate it either. This leads to its own problem. All right, so getting back to too butt, sticking my fanny out, the problem with a tight hamstring here, because tight isn't enough information, we need to ask ourselves, how is it tight? Basically, your hamstring, most of them attach to your sit bones here, and they run to the backs of the knees. And if I'm sticking my fanny up like this, the distance from that sit bone down to the backs of the legs is greater. So I'm stretching my hamstring out already. It's tight, but it's what we call locked long. I've created more length in my hamstring, and it's tight. This, a lot of times, can be caused by a shortness in whatever is here. It's called your hip flexors, in this case your psoas. Now, although I'm pointing my belly here, what I'm really talking about is my lower spine, the front of my lower spine. There's a muscle that extends, passes through the pelvis, front of the pelvis, and then connects to the outer leg bones. If these muscles are short, I'll get into that too butt, anterior tilt to the pelvis. So if I'm stretching out my hamstrings, what I'm doing is I'm keeping this shortness of my psoas so that as I stand up, I've never stretched this out. So I'm stretching my hamstrings, I'm still in this kind of sway back, and now I'm complaining that my hamstrings are tight all the time. So what I have to do is do something to create length on this side of my body. Great ways to do that are anything that does what we call extension of the hips. Something as simple as this could be extension of the hips, but in yoga we'll come into more of our lunge poses, nice deep lunge poses. You can do like a low kneeling lunge with the top of the foot releasing down, and rather than just dropping into a back bend, work on getting this back thigh nice and close to the ground, making sure that you're not dialing the knee out, but the whole top of the thigh is pointing towards the earth. This is a wonderful stretch. A lot of times too, we'll do the, I'll show it so I'm not giving you my backside. We'll do this foot grab back behind you. And then again, it's not just about squeezing my heel to my butt, but really getting my back thigh as close to the ground as I can. And that is gonna open up the front of the right leg in that particular case. So that's what I think, that if you're having tight hamstrings, but you've got the too butt thing going on with your pelvis, I would argue that you need to spend more time stretching this out so that you can come to a neutral pelvis, so that as you're stretching out your hamstrings, they're not going to hurt, cause you any lower back problems, and we'll be able to use it to facilitate correcting the tilt of your pelvis. All right, now let's go to the other side of that. If you are not too butt, if you're kind of doing this pelvic tilt or tailbone tilt in the posterior pelvic tilt, then what we need to do is, obviously you can see as I start to fold, because forward fold, because my pelvis is tilted back, I'll get this gross rounding in the spine. Obviously that's not what we're looking for. In fact, your spine doesn't really forward fold all that well. We want to forward fold from the hips, but now I can't because I'm tipping my tailbone in this posterior tilt. I've made too much shortness back here in the hamstrings. So I need to do something that's going to be able to stretch that hamstring out. What I recommend that you do is, without getting into the definition of your posterior chain, but the connective tissues that runs from the bottoms of the feet up the backs of the legs continues all the way back through the back and then up through the skull. But if I'm peeling my toes up off of the ground, I start to stretch. the connective tissue, which is on the bottom of my foot, which runs through the Achilles tendon, connects to my calves, and the calves are literally wrapped around your hamstring at the back of the leg. So as I'm peeling my toes up off the ground, I want to make sure not only that I'm doing that, but make sure that my big toe and my little toe are staying equidistant from the earth. The little toe will tend to hook out towards the ground. That's just you're avoiding half of the hamstring stretch, namely the outside of the leg, the lateral side of your hamstrings. Okay, now once we've got that, what I want to make sure that I do is not round into the spine, but do my best to allow the forward fold to come from the pelvis. Once I find that place where I start to feel like I'm going to round, I make sure that I pause and just breathe into that. Yeah? And if you want to take this one more level, the foot that is not getting the stretch, I'm going to switch legs for you, peeling my toes up. The foot that's not getting in the stretch, it's almost like I'm in chair pose. And then I literally am going to take the arms up and over my head like I was in chair pose. And then just explore coming up and lowering down, again without rounding the spine, keeping your spine nice and extended. And that's when you'll really start to light up the backs of the knees, the calves, and create that stretch in the hamstrings, which is going to get you out of that locked short tendency. So I hope this was helpful to give you some perspective on the types of stretches that you want to do with your hamstrings. What I would recommend that you do is after class, after we've done like our regular 1 hour, 75-minute yoga class, you spend a little extra time just like trying to figure out, after you figure out the pelvic tilt, of course, just trying to figure out what stretches work for you that are going to either open up the hamstring and keep your spine long, or if you're doing the if your hamstring is in the two-butt maneuver, make sure that you're spending ample time stretching out your hip flexors before you start tapping into your hamstrings. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, Chris Temple, christempleyoga@gmail.com, or of course you can hit me up on Instagram or Facebook. I look forward to seeing you on the mat. Namaste.